Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when the British Empire was still figuring out what it wanted to be, other than perpetually damp and slightly condescending. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe loosen the blankets just a little. Because we're sailing, slowly, drowsily, into the warm waters of the South Pacific. To a tiny, green island called Tahiti, sometime around the late 18th century. The ocean is quiet. The air smells like salt and fruit. And on the horizon, a few ships of His Majesty's Navy appear, sails full, hulls creaking, carrying the kind of men who hadn't seen a woman in months, and hadn't seen a bathtub in longer. They were explorers. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. In reality, they were slightly lost, mostly sunburned, and operating under the general policy of, if it moves, map it. If it's friendly, trade with it. And if it's not, declare it a British possession anyway. Arrival in paradise, sort of. Our story begins, of course, with the HMS Dolphin, under the command of Captain Samuel Wallis, who arrived in Tahiti in 1767. Wallis wasn't necessarily looking for Tahiti. Few people in those days found anything on purpose. But when he did, he must have felt like he'd stumbled onto a dream. Lush hills. Sparkling water. Palm trees swaying lazily. And, most memorably, the locals, friendly, curious, and, at least to the sailors' eyes, beautiful. The Tahitians greeted them with gifts, songs, and a general lack of clothing, which the sailors took as a very positive sign. The British, ever the ambassadors of good taste, responded by immediately trying to trade. Now, when I say trade, I mean that in the loosest possible sense. The sailors noticed that the Tahitian women were fond of shiny metal objects. And the only shiny metal they had to spare were nails. Not gold. Not silver. Just nails, the kind holding the ship together. Which brings us to one of the strangest economic exchanges in early imperial history, nails for favors. Yes, those favors. The kind that would, eventually, leave the ship in severe structural danger. The Great Nail Shortage. At first, it was innocent enough. A few nails here and there, offered with the awkward charm of men who hadn't interacted with women since leaving Portsmouth. But very quickly, things got out of hand. Word spread across the island that the British were paying handsomely, in iron, for, let's say, personal diplomacy. And before long, the sailors were practically deconstructing the ship to keep the market satisfied. By the end of the first week, entire sections of the Dolphin were missing bolts and planks. Captain Wallis began to notice that the deck had developed a worrying amount of daylight coming through it. Imagine being a captain, walking up to your carpenter and asking, "Why does my ship appear to be collapsing?" And hearing, "Sir, it's because Jenkins traded the mainmast fittings for a good time." Wallis was not amused. He declared the nail trade strictly forbidden. Naturally, this made it 10 times more exciting. A brief lesson in iron economics. To the Tahitians, iron was basically magic. They had no native metal industry, so a single iron nail could slice through it like a god's finger. To the sailors, iron was, well, nails. They'd spent their entire lives surrounded by it. But now, nails had become currency. And for a brief, shining moment, the HMS Dolphin functioned like an 18th century Las Vegas, a floating exchange of metal for affection. It didn't take long for discipline to collapse. Marines were sneaking off deck. The blacksmith became the most popular man on board. And Wallis, poor man, was losing his mind trying to keep the ship both morally and physically intact. He wrote in his log that he feared the crew would take the ship apart entirely for the sake of their lusts. Which, if nothing else, shows a clear understanding of British naval priorities. Cultural misunderstandings galore. Now, to be fair, the Tahitians probably found the British equally confusing. Here were pale, wool-clad strangers who insisted on covering themselves head to toe in the tropics, drank something called grog, and constantly measured things. The British, in turn, misunderstood nearly everything about Tahitian culture. They saw friendliness and thought it was flirtation. They saw hospitality and mistook it for submission. Typical empire logic. If the locals smile, they're obviously ready to be colonized. Still, relationships were formed. Some genuine affection bloomed between sailors and Tahitian women. A few even wanted to stay behind, the dream of a tropical escape from the grey monotony of Britain. But, of course, that wasn't allowed. The ship eventually patched itself together, nails replaced as best they could be, and the Dolphin sailed away, leaving behind a small economic boom, a few broken hearts, and several confused islanders wondering why anyone would wear so many buttons. Captain Cook arrives, because of course he does. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've made it this far, through the centuries of vows and whispers, through the incense and candlelight, through the long, sleepless silence of cloister walls, we're almost at the end. Tonight, we're stepping gently out of the Middle Ages and into the trembling dawn of something new, the Reformation. A time when faith cracked open like old stone, and all the quiet hypocrisies of the church finally spilled out into the light. For 1,000 years, celibacy had been the holy ideal. It was what separated the clergy from the common man, the sacred from the sinful. But by the 16th century, that illusion was fraying. People had started to notice that priests were preaching purity by day and raising children by night. And someone, inevitably, was going to call them on it. That someone was Martin Luther. Now, Luther wasn't the first to complain about the church's issues. Plenty of others had pointed out the corruption, the indulgences, the expensive sins-for-sale scheme that made Rome fabulously wealthy. But Luther, bless him, had a knack for saying what everyone else was thinking, and saying it loudly. When he nailed his famous 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he wasn't just starting a theological debate. He was starting a social revolution. One of his more radical ideas, though it sounds almost quaint now, was that priests should be allowed to marry. He argued that celibacy wasn't natural, that the human body wasn't the enemy. That marriage was, in fact, a more honest path to holiness than pretending to live without desire. You can almost hear the collective gasp echoing across Europe. The Catholic hierarchy was horrified. The reformers, meanwhile, were quietly relieved. Because it meant they could finally stop living double lives. Luther himself led by example. In 1525, he married Katharina von Bora, a former nun who had fled her convent with several other women after reading his writings. The story of their marriage is surprisingly tender, and a little bit funny. Katharina was practical, sharp-tongued, and entirely unimpressed by fame. Luther once admitted she ruled the household with a firmer hand than I. She brewed beer, managed finances, and argued theology over dinner. He adored her for it. Their marriage scandalized Europe, the ex-monk and the ex-nun, standing together as husband and wife. But it also became a powerful symbol. It said, in essence, holiness and humanity don't have to be enemies. Of course, not everyone made the transition so gracefully. When the Reformation swept through, thousands of monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized, their libraries scattered. Monks and nuns were turned out into a world that had no place for them. Some returned to families they hadn't seen in decades. Some became teachers or scribes. Some, quite a few, actually, got married. It must have been a strange adjustment. Imagine spending 30 years chanting at dawn, only to wake up one day and realize you're allowed to talk during breakfast. That you can hold someone's hand. That you don't have to confess it afterward. There are letters from former monks describing the awkward joy of married life, like learning to be human all over again. One wrote, "I am clumsy in affection, but my wife forgives me kindly, as if I were a child." Another confessed that he still woke up before sunrise to pray, out of habit, not holiness. It's oddly moving, the quiet dignity of people learning to live without guilt. Meanwhile, in Catholic Europe, the old rules held firm. The Church doubled down on celibacy as a mark of discipline. They argued that marriage distracted priests from their sacred duties, as if holiness depended on loneliness. The Council of Trent, held in the mid-16th century, reaffirmed celibacy as the shining crown of the clergy. But it also quietly acknowledged the obvious. They were losing ground. Because the world outside the cloister was changing fast. Printing presses were spreading new ideas. Common people were reading scripture for themselves. And the notion that desire was shameful was starting to seem, well, a little medieval. Still, the centuries of monastic restraint didn't disappear overnight. Even in Protestant regions, the memory of celibacy lingered like incense, faint but persistent. It shaped art, morality, and the way people thought about love itself. You can hear it in the music of the time, in the hymns that spoke of divine longing, still echoing the language of old monastic devotion. You can see it in the paintings, where saints gaze upward with that same soft intensity that once filled cloisters. Desire had finally been let out of its cell. But it hadn't lost its holiness. It had simply changed form. And what of those who never married? Some monks chose to remain celibate even after they were freed from their vows. Not out of guilt, but because solitude had become a kind of peace. One former Carthusian, writing in 1550, said, "I have seen both the silence of the cell and the noise of the tavern. I have loved neither, but learned from both." It's a line that feels like the end of something ancient, a quiet understanding that discipline and desire can coexist, without either destroying the other. By the 17th century, monastic celibacy had lost its monopoly on holiness. People could be married and still be devout. Priests in Protestant lands could preach about love without blushing. And while the Catholic Church held onto its rules, even there, the tone began to soften. The medieval obsession with controlling the body gave way, slowly, to a gentler idea that the body was part of the soul's journey, not its enemy. It's strange to think that it took 1,000 years of denial to arrive at such a simple truth. So now, as we drift toward the end of our long, quiet night among monks and mystics, it's worth pausing to listen, not to the chant of prayers, but to the silence beneath them. It's the sound of human longing. For connection. For meaning. For peace between the spirit and the flesh. The monasteries may have fallen, the vows may have faded, but that longing never went away. It just found new places to live, in love songs, in letters, in whispered prayers at night. Because holiness, in the end, was never about walls or vows or rules. It was about how gently we carry our desires, how honestly we live with them, without shame. And maybe, just maybe, that's the quiet redemption all those restless monks were searching for. So, as we close our eyes and let the last echo of the bells fade into the dark, let's remember them kindly, the weary, well-intentioned souls who tried to make saints of themselves by denying what made them human. They failed, of course. But they failed beautifully. And in that failure, they left behind something strangely comforting, a reminder that even in silence, even in restraint, the heart keeps whispering. Always. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've already made it further than most sailors on the HMS Bounty. Let's keep drifting. We're still somewhere in the Pacific, where the air is thick, the sea is gentle, and the mood is mildly insubordinate. It's 1787. The British Empire is expanding, experimenting, and, like an overconfident dinner guest, turning up uninvited to every corner of the globe. And in the middle of it all sails Captain William Bligh. Bligh was a man of precision, a master navigator, and utterly incapable of letting anything slide. He was the sort of person who would measure your teacup before scolding you for holding it incorrectly. And, as you might imagine, that personality type doesn't do well when confined on a ship for months with men who'd rather be anywhere else. The mission that should have been simple. The goal was straightforward, at least on paper. The Bounty would sail to Tahiti, collect hundreds of breadfruit trees, and transport them to the Caribbean. Why? Because some very clever men in London thought enslaved workers in the West Indies might appreciate a cheap new source of carbohydrates. This, in typical imperial fashion, was done without asking anyone involved, the Tahitians, the sailors, or the enslaved people. But, of course, it was for the good of science and progress. Which usually meant it was for the good of someone else's wallet. The voyage began, as so many do, with optimism. Bligh was confident. His crew was eager. The sea was calm. And everyone pretended to like each other. That lasted about a week. Bligh's style of leadership. Bligh had served under Captain Cook, and apparently took notes only on the yelling parts. He believed discipline was the key to success, the louder, the better. His lectures were long, his punishments creative, and his sarcasm, withering. He had a habit of calling his officers damned rascals and cowardly dogs, often during breakfast. He once accused his men of living like pigs, which, to be fair, might have been true, but saying it daily didn't help morale. Still, the bounty pressed on. Across the Atlantic, down around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. It took 10 long months to reach Tahiti, 10 months of storms, shortages, and the slow unraveling of patience. By the time they sighted land, even Bligh probably wanted to kiss the sand. 6 months in paradise. Tahiti greeted them just as warmly as before. Palm trees, laughter, and the same easy charm that had undone so many British sailors before. Bligh's orders were clear: stay long enough to collect and prepare the breadfruit plants, then leave. That was supposed to take a few weeks. It took 6 months. Now, 6 months is a long time to leave a crew unsupervised in paradise. The men built huts. They made friends. They learned the language. They got tattoos. And some, like Fletcher Christian, fell deeply in love. Christian was Bligh's second in command, intelligent, restless, and about one sarcastic comment away from a breakdown. At first, he and Bligh got along. Bligh even treated him almost like a friend. But that friendship began to corrode under the Tahitian sun. Bligh saw the crew becoming soft. Christian saw the captain becoming unbearable. And somewhere between the breadfruit trees and the endless lectures, something snapped. Trouble brews on the horizon. When it came time to leave, the men were reluctant. They had families now, of a sort. Homes, comfort, and a tropical version of happiness. But duty called. And Bligh made sure they heard it, loudly. The ship was loaded with over 1,000 young breadfruit plants, carefully potted and watered daily. Bligh called them His Majesty's plants. He loved those plants more than his crew. Possibly more than life itself. Every morning, he'd check them personally, scolding anyone who so much as splashed seawater too close to them. Meanwhile, his men went hungry because the water supply was being diverted for the plants. You can imagine how that went over. Fletcher Christian loses his patience. As weeks passed, Bligh's temper worsened. He accused Christian of theft, incompetence, even mutiny, ironically, before the mutiny actually happened. Christian, once loyal, began to fantasize about staying behind in Tahiti for good. He even confided to another sailor that he'd rather swim back to shore than endure another day of Bligh's lectures. And then, one quiet morning in April 1789, he did something even more dramatic. The mutiny. The sun was just rising. The air was still and warm. Most of the crew was half awake. Christian, pale and trembling, burst into Bligh's cabin with a small group of sailors. They tied the captain's hands, told him quietly that it was over, and marched him up on deck. Bligh, ever articulate even when kidnapped, shouted insults for a solid 5 minutes, words that echoed across the water like an angry parrot. But it was no use. The mutineers lowered a small open boat, a launch, about 7 meters long, and forced Bligh and 18 loyal men into it. They gave him a little food, a compass, and a sarcastic good luck. Then they cut the rope. The bounty drifted one way. Bligh, the other. The voyage of survival. What followed should have killed him. But Bligh, for all his faults, was one of the finest navigators alive. He steered that tiny open boat for 47 days, covering over 3,600 nautical miles through storms, starvation, and near mutiny again. He rationed every crumb of food, charted the stars, and somehow kept them alive. When they finally reached safety in Timor, Bligh had lost a third of his men, most of his sanity, and absolutely none of his self-righteousness. He immediately began writing reports, long, detailed ones, ensuring the entire Admiralty knew he was both a genius and a victim. And to his credit, he was half right. Back on the bounty. Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian and his fellow mutineers tried to enjoy their victory. They turned the bounty back toward Tahiti, greeted like heroes by the islanders who remembered them. For a few months, it must have felt like paradise again, laughter, love, and the comforting illusion that they'd gotten away with it. But reality arrived soon enough. The British Navy doesn't forget things like grand theft ship. The mutineers realized they couldn't stay. Some remained in Tahiti, hoping for mercy. Christian, however, took a smaller group and sailed off into the unknown. They ended up on a tiny, isolated rock in the South Pacific, Pitcairn Island, so remote it wasn't even on most maps. There, they burned the bounty to avoid detection and tried to start over. It didn't go well. Life on Pitcairn. At first, things seemed idyllic. They built houses, planted gardens, and lived with their Tahitian companions. But paradise has a way of souring when you mix alcohol, jealousy, and too many British officers. Arguments erupted. Violence followed. Within a few years, nearly all the original mutineers were dead, killed in fights, accidents, or revenge. Fletcher Christian's fate is still uncertain. Some say he was murdered. Others claimed he died by suicide. And a few romantics insisted he escaped, living out his days quietly under another name. But the truth is likely far less poetic. Pitcairn became a lonely graveyard of dreams and bad decisions. Bligh's return and reputation. Back in London, Bligh was hailed as a survivor, a man of almost superhuman navigation. He was court-martialed. Yes, that was standard procedure after losing a ship, but he was acquitted and even promoted. He later commanded other expeditions, including another successful breadfruit run. He also managed to spark several more mutinies, which might suggest the common denominator wasn't luck. Eventually, he became governor of New South Wales, where, unsurprisingly, his harsh leadership led to yet another rebellion, the Rum Rebellion of 1808. It seems wherever Bligh went, someone eventually tied him up. The ironies of empire. And so the story ends the way it began, with irony. The bounty set sail to spread an exotic food for economic exploitation. Instead, it spread one of history's most enduring legends. The breadfruit experiment itself? A failure. The enslaved workers in the Caribbean didn't want it. It grew well enough, but no one cared. The real fruit of the voyage was the myth, the idea of paradise, rebellion, and freedom from authority. It became the subject of books, paintings, plays, and eventually, Hollywood films. Each retelling made it grander, more romantic, and slightly less true. Because, of course, that's what humans do with stories. We sand off the edges, paint them in softer colors, and pretend paradise was only ever lost because someone else ruined it. Drifting out. So, picture it now, the Pacific at night. 1,000 stars overhead. The bounty long gone, its ashes sinking slowly beneath the waves. Somewhere, Bligh's little boat cuts through the darkness, guided by a stubborn will and a sense of grievance large enough to power a small city. Somewhere else, on Pitcairn, a handful of survivors stare out at the horizon, wondering if the world has forgotten them. And it mostly has. But the legend remains, quiet, shimmering, half-truth and half-dream. A reminder that sometimes paradise isn't lost, it's just badly managed. Let's drift onward. The Pacific fades behind us, and the candlelight of another story begins to flicker. Next, we'll wander into a different kind of empire, one colder, more gilded, and considerably less tanned. We'll meet royals who ruled entire continents but couldn't manage their own family trees. Because, of course, that's where things really start to get strange. Hey everyone. Welcome back. If you're still awake, that's either impressive or a sign of caffeine abuse. Tonight, we're leaving the tropics behind. No more palm trees, no more warm breezes. Now we drift into the cold, candlelit corridors of Europe's most famously interrelated dynasty, the Habsburgs. This was a family that ruled half the known world, and yet somehow couldn't produce a jawline that functioned properly. They were rich, powerful, and catastrophically inbred. And they held onto their thrones not through charm, but through marriages that resembled very expensive hostage negotiations. So, tuck in. Because we're entering a world of portraits, powdered wigs, and genetic errors that should have come with warning labels. Let others wage war, you, lucky Austria, marry. That was the Habsburg motto, and, honestly, they took it very literally. While other dynasties fought for territory, the Habsburgs just married for it. Need Spain? Marry Spain. Want Burgundy? Marry Burgundy. Accidentally marry your cousin twice? Even better, it keeps the land tidy. By the 16th century, their family tree had more loops than a sailor's knot. It wasn't so much a tree as a tangled hedge. And somewhere deep inside it, genetics quietly waved a white flag. Charles II of Spain, the last, and most unfortunate, Habsburg. Let's begin with the man who symbolized the end of the line, Charles II of Spain. He ruled from 1665 to 1700 and was, frankly, the living embodiment of why you should occasionally marry outside your family. Charles was the product of nearly 200 years of non-stop intermarriage. His father, Philip IV, married his own niece, which meant Charles's family tree looked like a circle drawn by someone who'd gotten dizzy halfway through. The result was not ideal. Charles suffered from a range of severe genetic problems. He was weak, sickly, and reportedly couldn't chew properly due to what's politely called the Habsburg jaw, a protruding chin so pronounced it could probably open letters. Contemporaries described him, with typical royal politeness, as of delicate constitution and peculiar aspect. Translation: he looked like he'd lost a fight with a loaf of bread. He had trouble speaking, walking, and, unfortunately for Spain, producing heirs. For nearly 4 decades, Europe watched and waited to see if Charles could do the one thing a king was supposed to do: continue the line. Spoiler: he could not. The royal science experiment. Doctors tried everything. Potions, prayers, even exorcisms, because when in doubt, blame demons. At one point, they made him drink the powdered skull of a saint. Another time, he was told to sleep with holy relics under his pillow. He did all this while ruling one of the largest empires on earth, which makes it hard to argue he didn't at least try. But nothing worked. He remained frail, infertile, and increasingly paranoid. He was convinced someone had cursed him, which, in fairness, might have been true if you count the family genetics as witchcraft. By his final years, Charles was little more than a walking ghost, convinced he'd been hexed by sorcery and surrounded by ministers who used his weakness to pull strings behind the throne. When he died at 38, without a single child, Spain mourned, not for him exactly, but for the chaos that followed. The War of the Spanish Succession, because why not? Charles's death triggered one of Europe's messiest inheritance disputes. Everyone wanted Spain's empire, France, Austria, Britain, all convinced they deserved a slice. And, naturally, they solved it the civilized way. By fighting a war that lasted 13 years. Millions suffered, thousands died, and entire regions were devastated, all because one man's family couldn't stop marrying itself. But the Habsburgs didn't learn. They just started a new branch of their dynasty in Austria, continuing the fine tradition of genetic confusion for another 2 centuries. The Austrian Habsburgs, keeping it in the family. Let's drift forward to Vienna. Golden halls. Marble floors. So many chandeliers that you start to wonder how anyone could feel gloomy here. And yet, the Habsburgs managed it. Inbreeding continued, though now they mixed in a few new faces, distant cousins, minor princesses, anyone sufficiently royal. The results were still complicated. Many of them were short, pale, and given to mysterious illnesses. And yet they ruled vast territories: Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and a few reluctant corners of Italy that had probably stopped keeping count. Maria Theresa, the exception. Every so often, a Habsburg came along who was competent, intelligent, and surprisingly normal. Maria Theresa was one of them. She became empress in 1740, ruling over a patchwork empire that was already falling apart at the seams. Unlike her ancestors, she wasn't particularly inbred, a refreshing change. She spoke multiple languages, reorganized the army, and generally acted like she knew what she was doing. She also had 16 children. 16. Which, frankly, feels excessive, but when you've inherited centuries of reproductive anxiety, maybe overcompensation is natural. One of those children was Marie Antoinette, yes, the let them eat cake one, though she probably never said it. Marie Antoinette, the misunderstood disaster. Marie grew up in Vienna's polished courts, surrounded by music, manners, and powdered diplomacy. Then, at 14, she was married off to the French Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, as part of yet another dynastic alliance. Her job was simple: unite Austria and France through charm and childbirth. The first part went moderately well. The second took a while. Louis XVI was shy, awkward, and more interested in locks and keys than in his wife. For 7 years, their marriage went unconsummated. Europe gossiped endlessly. Pamphlets circulated suggesting Marie was barren, frigid, or simply cursed, though, to be fair, the Habsburg family history gave that rumor some weight. Eventually, with medical advice and perhaps a bit of motivation from both families, things worked out. Children followed. But by then, the damage to her reputation was done. She was seen as frivolous, foreign, and out of touch, the perfect scapegoat for a starving nation. When the French Revolution arrived, Marie became its lightning rod. She and Louis were imprisoned, then executed. Her last words, according to legend, were an apology for stepping on her executioner's foot. Which is, if nothing else, very on brand for a woman raised in 18th century etiquette. The late Habsburgs, ghosts in uniform. After Marie Antoinette, the Austrian branch continued. But the world around them was changing. Empires were collapsing. Nations were rising. And the Habsburgs were still pretending it was 1690. They lived in palaces large enough to get lost in, held balls no one wanted to attend, and issued decrees that no one cared about. By the 19th century, they'd become walking relics, ceremonial, decorative, and increasingly tragic. Franz Joseph, the last great emperor. Then came Franz Joseph I, who ruled from 1848 to 1916. That's 68 years, a reign so long it could make a statue tired. He became emperor at 18, after his uncle abdicated during a revolution. And from that moment, Franz Joseph seemed determined to outlive absolutely everyone. He was disciplined, punctual, and emotionally constipated, a man who treated routine as religion. He rose at dawn every day, wore the same uniform, and ate the same meal. He married his cousin, Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Cece, a beautiful, restless woman who loathed court life and spent most of her marriage traveling or refusing to eat. Their relationship was frosty. He adored her. She tolerated him. And together they embodied the sad dignity of an empire that still looked impressive but was rotting quietly from within. Cece, the melancholy empress. Cece was the 19th century equivalent of a celebrity influencer trapped in a royal contract. She wrote poetry about loneliness, obsessed over her waistline, and reportedly spent 3 hours a day having her ankle-length hair brushed. She also hated politics, court etiquette, and the constant scrutiny of Vienna's gossipy elite. Her life became a series of escapes, long rides, foreign trips, endless attempts to outrun her own gilded boredom. In 1898, while walking in Geneva, she was stabbed by an Italian anarchist. Her corset was so tight she didn't realize she was mortally wounded until minutes later. Her death shocked Europe, but to the Habsburgs, tragedy was almost a family tradition by then. The slow collapse. Franz Joseph endured it all, the death of his wife, his only son's suicide, and the slow decay of his empire. By the early 1900s, the Habsburg monarchy was a fragile relic surrounded by restless nationalities demanding independence. Then came his heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination in 1914 sparked World War I, because, naturally, even dying royals managed to cause paperwork. The Great War destroyed what centuries of inbreeding and bad luck had only threatened. By 1918, the Habsburg Empire was gone. Austria was a small republic. And the surviving royals were politely asked to leave their palaces. The final Habsburgs. The last emperor, Charles I, tried to reclaim his throne twice. Both attempts failed miserably, and he was exiled to Madeira, where he died of pneumonia at age 34, a fittingly damp end to a famously unlucky family. By then, Europe had moved on. Democracies, dictators, and ideologies replaced dynasties. And the Habsburgs faded into history, a long, faint echo of powdered faces, ceremonial marriages, and portraits that all looked vaguely related. Today, a few descendants remain. Some are writers, some historians, a few politicians. But the glory is gone. And perhaps, finally, the family tree has stopped looping back on itself. A gentle reflection. It's strange, isn't it? For centuries, The Habsburgs were the center of the world, emperors, kings, archdukes, the ultimate power players of Europe. But their obsession with purity, control, and tradition became their undoing. All that effort to preserve a bloodline, only to end with weak heirs, tragic marriages, and an empire that couldn't survive the 20th century. It's hard not to feel a little sorry for them, these pale, melancholy figures in starched collars, trapped by duty and each other. They wanted immortality. What they got was a cautionary tale, one best told slowly, under low light, preferably while half asleep. So, as we let the Habsburgs fade into the velvet dark, think of them not as villains or victims, but as reminders that even the grandest dynasties crumble. And even the most powerful families eventually need to rest. Let's drift onward again. Our next stop is still royal, still a little ridiculous, but far colder, and with more fur hats. Because next, we'll visit the Romanovs, the doomed rulers of Russia, whose final bedtime story ended in a basement. Let's drift forward, just a little. The story so far has been, well, equal parts romantic and awkward. The British, freshly arrived, were exchanging iron nails for the company of Tahitian women, while scribbling in their journals about the untouched innocence of the native soul. It was all very poetic, in the sort of way that makes you roll your eyes slightly. Because while the sailors were congratulating themselves on having found paradise, they were also doing what Europeans in the 18th century did best, spreading diseases they didn't know they had. Now, to be fair, no one aboard the Endeavour was consciously thinking, let's introduce smallpox to this island. They didn't even understand what germs were. But contact with the crew brought a slow, creeping sickness to a population that had no immunity to European diseases. It didn't happen all at once, it took a few years and several ships, but the first meeting, in 1769, was the beginning of something Tahiti would never recover from. At the time, of course, the visitors didn't notice much. They were too busy admiring the view, collecting plants, and wondering how to describe a place that felt more like a dream than a chartable piece of geography. Cook himself, in his quiet and restrained way, kept writing about the people's good nature, their amiable disposition, and the pleasing manner in which they go about everything. Which as explorers speak for, we're being treated far better than we deserve. The local chiefs, meanwhile, were taking careful mental notes. They weren't naive. They saw that these pale visitors brought useful things, iron, tools, cloth, beads, and strange new foods. But they also noticed the British were oddly weak in some ways. They were easily sunburned. They got sick if they drank the wrong water. And their leader, Cook, kept making long speeches about the King of England, a man none of them had met and who, frankly, sounded imaginary. Still, Tahitians were polite enough to nod and smile. And in return, they asked for the things that actually mattered, metal, weapons, and sometimes, a few kisses. Iron was the new gold. Before the arrival of Europeans, Tahitians used bone, stone, and shell tools. They were beautiful, but limited. When iron appeared, everything changed. A single nail could be turned into a cutting blade sharper than anything they'd had before. It was like going from the Stone Age to the Iron Age overnight, with the added bonus that the iron came from cheerful strangers who seemed more than willing to trade it for affection. The British, for their part, were astonished at how eagerly the women made these trades. They were used to societies in which women were heavily guarded or ignored entirely. Tahitian women, by comparison, were open, laughing, curious. But of course, what the British didn't understand, or perhaps didn't want to understand, was that these exchanges weren't just flirtations. They were part of a local system of hospitality, of ritual and diplomacy. The Tahitians saw Cook's men not as romantic partners, but as guests to be managed, amused, and, when necessary, exploited. The sailors, being sailors, took everything literally. They assumed it was love. Let's drift a little further into this misunderstanding. You see, the British thought they were discovering a paradise of innocence. But the Tahitians were far more practical. They knew exactly what they were doing. When a woman shared time with a British sailor, she might be rewarded with iron, beads, or cloth, things that held real value in her society. Her family benefited, too. These were acts of exchange, woven into a complex web of social expectations. Cook, the ever-disciplined observer, tried to regulate it. He issued orders: no taking of women without consent, no giving of nails or tools for private favors, and, above all, no quarrels with the locals. But rules and sailors are famously incompatible. Within days, Cook's own forge was half dismantled, his nails gone, and his blacksmith threatening to mutiny because his tools had mysteriously vanished. It was, in short, chaos. By the time the Endeavour left Tahiti, it was lighter by several hundred pounds of metal and heavier by a few scandalous stories. The sailors sailed away smirking, pockets full of curiosities, hearts perhaps a little bruised. The Tahitians, meanwhile, were left with a strange collection of trinkets, a few useful tools, and a faint sense that the world was about to get much bigger and much more complicated. When Cook returned a few years later, the atmosphere was different. Some of the same women were there, but older now, their laughter more restrained. New diseases had spread. Iron was no longer rare, it had become almost ordinary. And the Tahitians were already beginning to see what the arrival of Europe truly meant: not friendship, but dependency. Not paradise, but possession. Cook, of course, didn't intend it that way. He was a man of maps and measurements, not conquest. But behind him, following his routes, would come the missionaries, the merchants, and the empire itself. Tahiti's innocence, or rather, the British fantasy of its innocence, was gone. And yet, in the records, the story was told as a romantic adventure. The Happy Isle, they called it. The earthly paradise of the South Seas. They wrote songs and poems about it, painted idealized portraits of bronzed bodies and smiling faces. None of them mentioned the coughs, the fevers, or the quiet worry that spread through the villages after the ships had gone. Let's drift on, quietly, to the next curious detail. Even decades later, sailors still talked about Tahiti as if it had been a dream. They remembered the warmth, the beauty, the easy laughter. They conveniently forgot that they'd been the walking embodiment of global imbalance, carrying iron, guns, and germs into a place that had none of those things. It's strange, really. They thought they were exploring the unknown, but in a way, they were the ones being studied, catalogued, assessed, and, ultimately, understood far better than they understood themselves. The Tahitians saw through them. They always had. And that's the quiet truth behind those soft watercolor paintings of palms and smiling faces. The British thought they were exchanging nails for love. The Tahitians were exchanging moments for survival. As we drift toward the end of this story, the ocean grows calm again. The Endeavour sails westward. Cook stands at the railing, staring back at the island that had seemed so perfect. He doesn't know that in 50 years, missionaries will arrive to ban dancing, tattooing, and half the island's old customs. He doesn't know that smallpox will take thousands. Or that iron, once so precious, will soon be cheap and rusting. All he knows, in that quiet moment, is that he's leaving behind something he can't quite describe, a place that will live on in stories, half-truths, and wistful myths. Let's leave him there for now, in that gentle evening light. The water glows gold around the ship's hull. The voices of the islanders fade into the wind. And somewhere in the background, a blacksmith sighs, realizing he'll never see those missing nails again. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, or half-dreaming, let's drift a little further down this story. The sea is calm again. The sails of the Endeavour have long since disappeared over the horizon. And somewhere in the South Pacific, James Cook is plotting new lines on a map, neat, measured lines across an ocean that never asked to be measured. By now, Cook has become something of a celebrity back home. The journals of his first voyage, the one with all the nails, the favors, and the unfortunate spread of European germs, made him famous. London society adored the idea of a man bringing civilization to paradise. It made them feel adventurous without leaving their chairs. But fame, as always, changes things. By the time Cook returned for his second voyage, he wasn't just an explorer. He was a symbol, a man who was supposed to prove that the British Empire's curiosity was noble and humane. Which is always the first step towards something deeply ironic. You can almost imagine him, standing at the rail of his next ship, the Resolution, looking out over endless blue water, wondering what noble and humane was supposed to mean while half his crew were hungover and the other half were stealing biscuits. Cook's second voyage, starting in 1772, took him even farther, into colder waters, toward the ice and fog of the Antarctic Circle. This was no tropical paradise. The men missed Tahiti terribly. They missed the warmth, the laughter, the easy rhythm of island life. Here, there was only the sound of wind, the groaning of ice against the hull, and Cook's increasingly strict discipline. He was changing. The calm, methodical observer of Tahiti had hardened into something sharper. The years at sea had worn him down, and the weight of expectations back home, the pressure to be the man who discovered everything, made him restless. You could say the explorer's curse is that the more they find, the less they feel. Each new horizon promises wonder, but brings only more responsibility. Cook had seen the Polynesian world, its grace, its complexity, and yet his orders kept pushing him to measure, to claim, to define. To turn people and places into coordinates and names. So he did. Because that's what good officers do. The Resolution crossed into waters that no European ship had ever seen before. Cook didn't find the mythical southern continent he'd been told to look for, just endless fields of drifting ice. But he found something else, exhaustion. The kind that sinks into a man's bones and never really leaves. When he returned to warmer latitudes, to the islands he'd once admired, he found them changed too. The Tahitians now knew the value of European goods, and the danger of European diseases. Other European ships had come and gone, leaving behind confusion, violence, and greed. Cook's paradise was no longer untouched. He must have sensed it. The journals from his second voyage are colder, more clinical. There's less wonder in his words, more measurement. The human warmth of those first encounters had been replaced by a kind of wary distance. And yet, he kept going. Because he had one more voyage left in him, the one that would take him to his end. Let's drift into that, slowly. It's 1776 now. Britain is busy losing the American colonies, but Cook doesn't know that yet. He's been sent on a final mission, to find the Northwest Passage, a mythical sea route through the Arctic that would link the Pacific to the Atlantic. He sails again, this time with two ships, the Resolution and the Discovery. The names alone feel like irony waiting to happen. The first part of the voyage goes as planned. Cook revisits old places, Tahiti, New Zealand, Tonga. But something in him has shifted. His discipline has turned to rigidity. His patience has worn thin. Even his officers, who once admired him, begin to whisper that he's not the same man. The locals notice, too. Cook's temper, once so controlled, begins to flare. His sense of superiority grows heavier, more visible. He's no longer the curious guest of the islands, he's the tired old teacher, lecturing everyone about order and obedience. And then, he reaches Hawaii. It's January 1779. The Hawaiian Islands, lush, volcanic, filled with chanting, smoke, and the smell of roasted breadfruit. To the Hawaiians, Cook's arrival happens to coincide with a sacred festival honoring Lono, the god of peace and fertility. And Cook's ship, with its great white sails, its strange noise, and its glittering decorations, looks eerily like the return of Lono himself. Naturally, the British interpret this as a warm welcome. They think they're being celebrated for their charm. The Hawaiians are simply following ritual, offering gifts and honors to what they believe is a god's temporary manifestation. It's not worship, exactly, it's protocol. The two sides misunderstand each other perfectly. Cook, of course, writes in his journal that the islanders are the most hospitable and open of all the peoples of the South Seas. Which is almost word for word what he wrote about Tahiti 10 years earlier. You can sense the repetition in his thoughts, a man trapped in his own legend, replaying it one last time. For a while, it's peaceful. There are feasts, exchanges, endless curiosity on both sides. The Hawaiians offer gifts of food, mats, and feathered cloaks. The British give beads, metal, and trinkets. It feels almost harmonious. But harmony, as history tends to remind us, has an expiration date. When Cook's ship is damaged by a storm, he decides to return to the island for repairs, but this time, the festival is over. The god Lono has already departed, symbolically speaking. And yet, here comes Cook again, walking back into the bay as though nothing has changed. To the Hawaiians, it's confusing. To some, it's blasphemous. Tensions rise. Small thefts lead to arguments. Cook, exhausted and brittle, responds with force. He orders punishments. He takes hostages. It's the old colonial pattern, replayed in miniature, order enforced through fear. And then, one morning, on a narrow beach at Kealakekua Bay, it all falls apart. Cook tries to take the local chief hostage after a stolen boat incident. A crowd gathers. Voices rise. Someone throws a stone. A musket fires. Cook turns, confused, and in that moment, the god becomes a man again. He's struck, stabbed, and dragged into the surf. The waves close over him, and the man who charted half the Pacific disappears into the water he thought he understood. It's a sad ending, though not a surprising one. His crew recovers some of his remains later, and they bury what's left at sea. The Hawaiians, for their part, perform their own rituals, not out of cruelty, but respect. To them, death and divinity were woven together in ways Cook could never quite grasp. And so, the great explorer ends where he began, surrounded by people he never fully understood. Let's pause here for a moment. Take a slow breath. The sound of the ocean in your imagination might be enough to carry you further into sleep. The British Empire, of course, went on to claim Cook as a hero. Statues were built. Books were written. They remembered his courage, his discipline, his scientific contributions, but rarely his arrogance, or the quiet tragedies he left behind. Tahiti, Hawaii, Aotearoa, Australia, all would feel the weight of what his voyages began. The age of exploration had turned into the age of empire. And the world, once vast and mysterious, had become a map filled with names that didn't belong to the people who lived there. Let's drift, softly, toward the final part of our story, the one that asks what happens after discovery. After the maps are drawn, the diseases spread, and the myths are written. Hey everyone, still here? Still drifting? Good. Let's keep floating, softly, slowly, into the afterglow of discovery. The sails have vanished. The ocean is quiet again. And all that remains are the stories. The Pacific, as the British imagined it after Cook's death, was a kind of dream, warm, gentle, and endlessly available. A paradise of half-remembered images, brown skin gleaming in sunlight, soft laughter, swaying palms. The reality, of course, was far more complicated. But dreams are convenient. Empires, especially, love convenient dreams. After Cook's voyages, the Pacific became a canvas for Europe's fantasies. Painters like John Weber turned his journals into gentle watercolor scenes, glowing, peaceful, slightly unreal. In London, people whispered about the noble savage in the Virgin Isles. They built entire philosophies on the idea that somewhere, out there, people lived uncorrupted by civilization. It was a comforting thought, especially if you lived in a smoky city that smelled faintly of sewage and burning coal. So they believed in paradise. They had to. It made empire feel less like theft and more like guidance. Meanwhile, on the actual islands, the aftermath of Cook's discoveries was unfolding in quiet, devastating ways. Diseases spread faster than news could travel. Ships arrived with missionaries, traders, and the occasional would-be adventurer who thought he might find a simpler life in the sun. The Tahiti Cook once described as innocent and free was changing. Chiefs who once ruled through kinship and ceremony now found themselves competing for imported goods. Iron tools and guns upset the delicate balance of power. And the missionaries, sincere, self-righteous, endlessly certain, began their work of salvation. Their message was simple: the islanders must be saved from themselves. Out went the dances, the tattoos, the open sexuality, the laughter under moonlight. These were sins, they said, remnants of heathen life. The irony, of course, was that the same behaviors had been adored by the very sailors who brought the missionaries in the first place. And so, the missionaries built chapels where temples once stood. They renamed villages with biblical words. They dressed the islanders in stiff, heavy clothes that trapped the heat and erased their color. It was called civilization. The Tahitians, to their credit, adapted in the way that most colonized peoples do, quietly, carefully, sometimes even cleverly. They adopted the new religion but gave it their own rhythm. They sang hymns, but in their own melodic patterns. They wore European clothes, but decorated them with patterns that told older stories. Survival, after all, isn't always resistance in the loud sense. Sometimes it's the art of blending in until the storm passes. But the storm never really passed. The 19th century brought more ships, more traders, and more diseases. The population of Tahiti fell sharply, from around 50,000 people at the time of Cook's visit to fewer than 10,000 by mid-century. Whole families vanished. Entire customs were forgotten or suppressed. And yet, the European imagination kept writing about paradise. Painters like Gauguin arrived in the 1890s, searching for a world that no longer existed, the one Cook's sailors had written about, and the missionaries had erased. Gauguin's Tahiti was a fantasy, painted in bright, impossible colors. His real Tahiti was poor, colonized, and full of contradictions. He was, of course, another kind of explorer, romantic, selfish, delusional. But his paintings kept the myth alive, the idea of a tropical innocence that Europe could long for, but never really understand. The same myth would drift into movies, postcards, and travel brochures. The Pacific was always shown as calm, simple, and happy, a place where the rest of the world's noise could fade away. The fact that this calm was built on conquest and cultural erasure didn't fit neatly into the frame. Let's pause here. The room is probably dim by now. Maybe you can hear the hum of something, a fan, a night breeze. The empire that began with Cook's voyages stretched across the world by the 19th century. The British flag fluttered over oceans, deserts, and mountain peaks. The language of exploration became the language of ownership. Discovery was just another word for possession. But even the empire couldn't hold on forever. The world changed again. The colonies rose. The old flags came down, one by one. Still, the ghosts of those first voyages remain, in the maps, the place names, and the strange contradictions of our modern world. Tahiti is now a part of France. Hawaii is a U.S. state. Cook's name appears on schools, towns, and ships. The story of his voyages is still taught as a tale of bravery and science, rarely as one of disruption and misunderstanding. And yet, there's something oddly human in all of it. Cook wasn't a villain. The sailors weren't demons. The Tahitians weren't saints. Everyone was caught in a moment of collision, between curiosity and arrogance, generosity and greed. It's a pattern that repeats itself endlessly in history. People searching for knowledge, finding power instead. People seeking paradise, creating ruin. And the strangest part? The myth still sells. Every tourist brochure, every travel ad with a palm tree and a sunset, echoes that old dream: somewhere, far away, there's a simpler life. But there isn't, really. There never was. Just people, everywhere, trying to make sense of one another. Let's drift toward the end now. The ocean in your mind is calm again, a steady shimmer of moonlight. Cook's ship is long gone. The laughter of the Tahitians has faded into memory, though perhaps it still echoes in the wind if you listen softly enough. History is never truly quiet, but tonight, it can be gentle. So rest, knowing that the world has always been a little absurd, a little tragic, and very, very human. The kind of story that never quite ends, it just changes shape, like waves curling against the shore. And with that, let's let the water close over our thoughts. The nails, the favors, the voyages, the myths, all of it drifting quietly into the distance. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting a little farther from the tropics and into something much colder, quieter, and far more repressed. Let's leave behind the waves of Tahiti and step inside a stone monastery in medieval Europe, where desire was forbidden, temptation was everywhere, and silence was the loudest sound of all. The air here smells of old wax, damp stone, and boiled vegetables. The walls are thick, the corridors narrow, and the rules, well, they're endless. The monks rise before dawn, chant in Latin, eat in silence, and, at least in theory, live lives of perfect chastity. Of course, the key word there is theory. Because for all the talk of holiness and purity, medieval monasteries were just as human as everywhere else. And wherever there are humans, there's desire, repressed, redirected, and occasionally, disastrously expressed. Let's drift gently into that contradiction, the strange world of medieval celibacy, where lust met Latin scripture and neither one came out unscathed. In the Middle Ages, the Church insisted that monks and nuns renounce all worldly pleasures. The body was seen as a burden, something to be conquered. Sex was not just forbidden, it was treated as the root of almost every sin. Desire was a crack in the soul where the devil could slip through. So monks built walls. Thick ones. They wore rough wool against their skin, ate plain food, and prayed endlessly. The idea was that if you punished the body enough, it would stop wanting things. It didn't. In one 12th century abbey, a young monk named Peter wrote anxiously in his diary that he was tormented by foul dreams and impure thoughts. He begged forgiveness daily. He fasted until he fainted. And still, the dreams returned, vivid, shameful, uncontrollable. His abbot, with all the wisdom of medieval psychology, advised him to sleep on the floor and drink less water. That didn't help either. By the 13th century, church leaders were well aware that monastic celibacy was more aspiration than reality. There were official complaints, long, Latin documents filled with phrases like immoderate familiarity with women, which is church speak for the monks are sneaking out. And sneak out they did. Some monasteries were located conveniently close to towns, taverns, and markets. Confession records from the period describe monks visiting prostitutes, meeting lovers by the river, or forming secret relationships with the nuns of nearby convents. One bishop complained that monks were keeping company with women who came to the cloister gate to sell eggs, milk, and themselves in equal measure. Naturally, the church responded with new rules. More supervision. More fasting. Stricter silence. In some places, walls were raised higher, windows shuttered tighter. The human spirit, as always, found loopholes. Let's drift quietly through one of those loopholes. A Benedictine monk named Aldhelm once wrote about the temptation of the mind. He warned that even if a monk never touched a woman, he could still sin by imagining one. The church agreed, desire itself was dangerous. Which made the inside of a monastery something like a psychological battlefield. Imagine being surrounded by silence, your every movement watched, every thought weighed for purity. The harder you tried not to think about sin, the more vividly it appeared in your mind. It's no wonder many monks dreamed of women, even in their prayers. The visions were sometimes framed as demonic. Succubi, they called them, female spirits who tempted holy men in their sleep. There are countless accounts of monks being visited at night by these unholy beings. The descriptions are detailed enough to make you suspect that not all of these encounters were entirely imaginary. The line between vision and fantasy, after all, is a thin one. Especially when you're hungry, sleep-deprived, and haunted by guilt. Still, not all monasteries were dens of repressed desire. Many were genuinely devout places, filled with quiet scholars who channeled their passion into manuscripts, art, and music. You might say that celibacy didn't kill desire, it transformed it. What couldn't be expressed in the body found its way into beauty. That's why so many medieval hymns read, frankly, like love poems to God. My soul thirsts for thee, one monk wrote, as the lover thirsts for the touch of his beloved. The language of divine union borrowed the same imagery as human passion. It was safer that way, the church could call it mysticism, not lust. But you can feel the undertones, even in the Latin. Beneath the pious words, there's something human, warm, desperate, and very much alive. Let's drift now into the women's side of this story, the convents. Life for nuns was no easier. They were told to be brides of Christ, which sounds poetic until you realize it meant lifelong isolation. Many were sent to convents against their will, younger daughters of noble families, inconvenient widows, women who simply stood in the way of an inheritance. Some found peace there. Others didn't. There are letters from medieval nuns begging to be released from their vows, confessing that they burned with sinful affection or dreamed of worldly pleasures. A few ran away, though escape usually ended badly. Still, convents had their moments of rebellion. there are records of nuns writing passionate letters to priests, of secret meetings behind chapel walls. A 14th century German abbess was caught hosting midnight feasts with visiting monks, complete with music, wine, and, apparently, very little prayer. Naturally, the church was horrified. But the truth is, medieval people didn't stop being human just because they put on robes. The monks prayed to forget the flesh, but they still had bodies. They still laughed, dreamed, got sick, and felt lonely. Some genuinely sought purity. Others just tried to survive their vows with sanity intact. If you wander through a ruined monastery today, through those cold corridors, past the echoing cloisters, it's easy to imagine the ghosts of those old contradictions still hanging in the air. The whispered prayers. The guilty sighs. The quiet scratching of quills writing confessions that no one was ever meant to read. Celibacy, in theory, was about discipline. But in practice, it was about tension, the kind that shapes art, poetry, and obsession. The human mind doesn't stop yearning just because the rules say it should. And maybe that's the quiet lesson the monasteries left behind, that even in silence, desire speaks. Even in stone, there are cracks where warmth seeps through. So as the candles flicker lower, and the chanting fades, let's leave the monks to their uneasy dreams. Tomorrow, they'll wake before dawn, wash in cold water, and pretend, once again, to be untouched by the world. But for tonight, in our drifting thoughts, we can admit what they never could, that holiness and hunger were never that far apart. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still here, still drifting through this candlelit corner of medieval history, take a slow breath. Because this next part, it's quieter, but somehow heavier. We're staying inside those stone walls, where prayers echo, wax melts down the same wooden holders night after night, and secrets are buried under centuries of pious routine. Tonight, we'll wander through the soft, scandalous corners of medieval monasteries, the places where love, guilt, and hypocrisy met under the watchful eye of God. Or at least, under the eyes of whoever was awake for matins at 3 a.m. By the 12th century, Europe was absolutely covered in monasteries. They were the social networks of their time, safe havens, libraries, hospitals, schools, and sometimes, hiding spots for those who didn't quite fit in elsewhere. On paper, these institutions were about spiritual perfection. In practice, they were filled with the same small dramas as any medieval village. Only quieter. You might think a vow of chastity would make life simple. It didn't. It just made people more creative about breaking it. One story from a Benedictine abbey in northern France tells of a monk and a nun who found, let's call it a spiritual connection. They met during confession, of course they did, and slowly, over months, their whispered prayers turned into something else entirely. They started meeting in the orchard after Compline, under the excuse of evening contemplation. Eventually, they were caught when another monk noticed a certain nun had started smelling faintly of apples. The punishment? The monk was sent to another monastery, conveniently far away, and the nun was locked in her cell for 40 days of reflection. Afterward, the abbot reminded everyone that temptation was the devil's favorite weapon, and that any affection not directed toward Christ was a path to ruin. No one, of course, asked why two lonely people might turn toward each other in a world that forbade tenderness. It was easier to blame Satan. These kinds of scandals weren't exactly rare. Church officials recorded them often, not because they enjoyed the gossip, though you can sense a certain relish in the details, but because they needed examples to warn others. In England, around the year 1270, a Cistercian monk named William was discovered sneaking out of the abbey through a hole in the wall to meet a widow from the nearby village. When confronted, he said that he had gone to pray with her. Which, admittedly, is one way to describe it. The abbot wasn't impressed. The hole was sealed, the widow was excommunicated, and William was ordered to spend the rest of his life in silence. A surprisingly fitting punishment, eternal quiet for a man who couldn't stop whispering. But the hypocrisy ran deeper than individual lapses. Many monasteries were financially tied to the very sins they condemned. Wealthy nobles paid for prayers, indulgences, and burial plots, all while maintaining very unholy personal lives. Monks would lecture peasants about purity, then dine on venison and fine wine donated by adulterous lords. The irony, of course, was thick enough to spread on bread. One chronicler even joked that monks were married to poverty, but seemed to be having an affair with luxury. Now, not all of these scandals involved lust. Some were about love in stranger forms. A 14th century story tells of a monk named Brother Thomas who became so attached to a carved statue of the Virgin Mary that he spoke to it daily, left it offerings, and claimed it smiled at him. When other monks confronted him, he insisted that the statue had returned his affection. They quietly took it away and replaced it with a plain wooden cross. Thomas reportedly stopped speaking for the rest of his life. It sounds absurd now, but in that quiet world of denial and longing, love had to go somewhere. If you couldn't love a person, you might love a symbol. If not a symbol, a saint. And if not a saint, then perhaps an idea. Monastic love was often displaced affection, the deep human need for connection, turned sideways and renamed devotion. And yet, there were moments when that transformation produced something beautiful. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, a 12th century abbess, composer, and mystic, pulse with that strange, sacred passion. She wrote of divine love as if it were physical light warming the soul, and of the body not as a prison, but as a vessel of creation. It was bold stuff for her time. Hildegard saw no contradiction between holiness and human feeling. She thought one could illuminate the other. Of course, the Church quietly ignored that part of her theology. It was easier to promote her as a saint than to unpack what she was actually saying. Now, let's drift towards something a little darker, the way these ideals of celibacy sometimes became twisted into control. For many, especially women, the monastery wasn't a refuge but a prison. Families used convents to dispose of daughters they didn't want to marry off, or wives who had outlived their usefulness. Once inside, escape was almost impossible. In one particularly grim case from 14th century Italy, a young noblewoman named Isata was forced into a convent after refusing an arranged marriage. She rebelled loudly and was punished with solitary confinement in a freezing cell for months. The chronicles say she eventually submitted to the will of God, which likely means she gave up. Not all stories end in quiet despair, though. Some nuns became cunning masters of their own environment. They wrote poetry, ran businesses, and even corresponded with kings, always in careful, pious language, of course. One abbess in France was so influential that local bishops came to her for approval. She once wrote to a monk who had criticized her leadership, "God gave me a mind and hands to use them. If you disapprove, take it up with him." That's the closest thing you'll find to a medieval mic drop. Back in the male monasteries, things continued much the same way, waves of reform followed by waves of corruption, rules made and quietly broken. A new order would always appear, claiming to restore purity. The Cluniacs, the Cistercians, the Carthusians. Each one promised stricter discipline, greater holiness, fewer temptations. And yet, give it a few decades, and the same human patterns crept back in. Ambition, pride, rivalry, and yes, desire. It's almost comforting, in a strange way, to know that even behind the strictest vows, the human heart kept beating stubbornly on. So as we drift out of these shadowed cloisters and into the cool medieval night, imagine the monks and nuns settling back into their cells. The candlelight flickers, the wind hums softly through the chapel cracks, and somewhere, a bell tolls for evening prayer. Outside, the stars look down, utterly indifferent, on all that quiet struggle between body and soul. They've seen it all before. Because for all our centuries of trying to rise above it, humanity keeps circling the same truth. Desire never really leaves. It just learns to whisper. Hey everyone, welcome back. The candles are still burning low, and the night outside the monastery walls has gone deep and heavy. If you're still awake, or half drifting somewhere between thought and dream, we're going to stay here a little longer, among the saints, the sinners, and the strange, very human spaces in between. Because tonight, we're not just talking about monks and nuns anymore. We're talking about the Church itself, that great medieval institution that tried, with admirable enthusiasm, to control human desire, and failed, spectacularly. Let's start with something simple. The medieval Church loved rules. It had rules for fasting, for praying, for breathing the right way while fasting and praying. But when it came to sex, it turned the human body into a moral battlefield. Desire was never neutral. It was either sacred, if properly channeled into marriage, or sinful. Everything else fell under a long list of offenses that clerics liked to call sins of the flesh. The irony, of course, was that the men writing these rules were often the ones breaking them. By the 10th century, the problem had gotten so bad that entire church councils were convened to address what they delicately called clerical incontinence. That's medieval Latin for "the priests won't stop sleeping with people." The issue wasn't just moral, it was logistical. Priests with families were passing down church property to their sons. So the church decided, quite firmly, that priests should be celibate. It sounded holy on paper. In practice, it created one of the longest-running hypocrisies in Christian history. Take Pope John XII, for example, a man whose idea of celibacy included turning the Lateran Palace into something of a medieval frat house. Contemporary reports claim he drank heavily, gambled during Mass, and kept mistresses in the papal chambers. One visiting nobleman described him, quite memorably, as a demon in the habit of a priest. He was eventually accused of invoking pagan gods for good luck during his dice games. So, not exactly saint material. He died in bed with another man's wife, which, depending on your perspective, might have been poetic justice or just predictable. Naturally, his successors promised reform. And naturally, very little changed. By the 12th century, priests across Europe were openly living with housekeepers who were, very obviously, their partners. There are entire letters from bishops pleading with priests to stop introducing their illegitimate children as their nephews. Some priests even formed quiet domestic arrangements, complete with shared gardens, dogs, and children who went on to become more priests. It was less a moral collapse and more a quiet acknowledgement of reality. Meanwhile, in monasteries, things were no better. The line between spiritual guidance and emotional manipulation was thin. Confession, meant to be a sacred exchange, often became a channel for something else. The church tried to regulate it with endless precision. They issued manuals for confessors, warning priests not to ask unnecessary questions about sexual acts. You can probably imagine why that rule had to exist. One manual from 13th century France cautioned priests to avoid inquisitiveness that might inflame temptation. Which is a poetic way of saying, stop turning confession into an erotic interview. But temptation wasn't so easily contained. When you tell an entire society that sex is shameful, you don't erase desire, you just bury it under layers of guilt and secrecy. And secrecy, as history shows us, has a way of festering. Let's drift toward the saints for a moment, because even they weren't immune to this strange tension. Saint Catherine of Siena, one of the most revered mystics in Catholic history, described her union with God in language that would make a modern editor blush. She spoke of Christ as her beloved spouse, and of their mystical marriage sealed with a ring only she could see. Her visions were filled with longing, emotional, spiritual, and unmistakably sensual. The Church, perhaps realizing how uncomfortable that sounded, chose to interpret it metaphorically. But Catherine wasn't the only one. Many saints, particularly women mystics, expressed their faith through the language of desire. They called it divine ecstasy, the soul's burning love for God. It was an acceptable outlet in a world where normal love was forbidden. But behind the pious language, you can still feel something deeply human, an echo of the same longing the monks tried to pray away. The irony here is that the Church, while preaching abstinence, built much of its culture around beauty, art, music, ritual. All sensual experiences. A monk might spend his life illuminating a manuscript, gold leaf, lapis lazuli, careful curves of ink, all to glorify God. But the act itself was intimate, loving, almost tender. Every brushstroke was, in its own quiet way, a rebellion against the coldness of doctrine. The Church condemned flesh, but it worshipped form, in architecture, in painting, in song. You can feel the contradiction every time you walk into a Gothic cathedral. The walls rise toward heaven, yes, but the carvings, the vines, the angels, the delicate human faces, are pure sensual joy. It's as if the builders couldn't help themselves. Even in worship, they needed the human touch. Of course, the Church did try to clamp down on the more obvious failures. By the late Middle Ages, There were official visitations, surprise inspections, basically, where bishops would show up to monasteries and ask uncomfortable questions. One such report from 14th century Germany lists several brothers given to the sin of drunkenness, a novice who keeps a songbird despite the rule, and the abbot's suspicious fondness for the young organist. You can almost hear the weary sigh in the Latin. In another inspection, a convent was accused of frivolous laughter and excessive conversation with visiting clerics, which sounds more like a staff party than a sin. But the real scandal was how normalized it all was. Everyone knew celibacy was impossible. Everyone also knew the church couldn't admit it. And so, the whole system rested on polite pretense, an unspoken agreement to keep the holy facade intact. And yet, through all this, there were people who genuinely tried to live by the ideal. There were monks who kept their vows with quiet discipline, priests who resisted temptation their whole lives. Some even achieved the peace the church promised, though they tended to write less about it, being busy actually living it. But the louder, messier stories survive. Because history, as always, remembers the cracks in the stone more vividly than the smooth surface. So as the night deepens, and the cloisters fall silent, it's tempting to wonder what the church might have looked like if it had embraced humanity instead of fearing it. If it had seen desire not as sin, but as something to be guided, an energy, not a curse. But perhaps that was never the point. The tension between purity and passion kept people obedient, repentant, and endlessly searching for redemption. It gave the church its power and its poetry. Because every whispered confession, every trembling hymn, every candle lit in the dark was, in the end, another small act of longing. Longing for forgiveness. For peace. For love, divine or otherwise. And that, more than any doctrine, is what kept the monasteries full and the cathedrals glowing for 1,000 years. Let's drift now, slowly, toward the edge of this story. The world outside is changing, new ideas stirring, new voices questioning. The Reformation is on the horizon, and with it, centuries of quiet vows will begin to crumble. But before we leave this cloistered world behind, we'll visit one last space, where faith and desire collide one final time. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've made it this far, through the centuries of vows and whispers, through the incense and candlelight, through the long, sleepless silence of cloister walls, we're almost at the end. Tonight, we're stepping gently out of the Middle Ages and into the trembling dawn of something new, the Reformation. A time when faith cracked open like old stone, and all the quiet hypocrisies of the church finally spilled out into the light. For 1,000 years, celibacy had been the holy ideal. It was what separated the clergy from the common man, the sacred from the sinful. But by the 16th century, that illusion was fraying. People had started to notice that priests were preaching purity by day and raising children by night. And someone, inevitably, was going to call them on it. That someone was Martin Luther. Now, Luther wasn't the first to complain about the church's issues. Plenty of others had pointed out the corruption, the indulgences, the expensive sins-for-sale scheme that made Rome fabulously wealthy. But Luther, bless him, had a knack for saying what everyone else was thinking, and saying it loudly. When he nailed his famous 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he wasn't just starting a theological debate. He was starting a social revolution. One of his more radical ideas, though it sounds almost quaint now, was that priests should be allowed to marry. He argued that celibacy wasn't natural, that the human body wasn't the enemy. That marriage was, in fact, a more honest path to holiness than pretending to live without desire. You can almost hear the collective gasp echoing across Europe. The Catholic hierarchy was horrified. The reformers, meanwhile, were quietly relieved. Because it meant they could finally stop living double lives. Luther himself led by example. In 1525, he married Katharina von Bora, a former nun who had fled her convent with several other women after reading his writings. The story of their marriage is surprisingly tender, and a little bit funny. Katharina was practical, sharp-tongued, and entirely unimpressed by fame. Luther once admitted she ruled the household with a firmer hand than I. She brewed beer, managed finances, and argued theology over dinner. He adored her for it. Their marriage scandalized Europe, the ex-monk and the ex-nun, standing together as husband and wife. But it also became a powerful symbol. It said, in essence, holiness and humanity don't have to be enemies. Of course, not everyone made the transition so gracefully. When the Reformation swept through, thousands of monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized, their libraries scattered. Monks and nuns were turned out into a world that had no place for them. Some returned to families they hadn't seen in decades. Some became teachers or scribes. Some, quite a few, actually, got married. It must have been a strange adjustment. Imagine spending 30 years chanting at dawn, only to wake up one day and realize you're allowed to talk during breakfast. That you can hold someone's hand. That you don't have to confess it afterward. There are letters from former monks describing the awkward joy of married life, like learning to be human all over again. One wrote, "I am clumsy in affection, but my wife forgives me kindly, as if I were a child." Another confessed that he still woke up before sunrise to pray, out of habit, not holiness. It's oddly moving, the quiet dignity of people learning to live without guilt. Meanwhile, in Catholic Europe, the old rules held firm. The Church doubled down on celibacy as a mark of discipline. They argued that marriage distracted priests from their sacred duties, as if holiness depended on loneliness. The Council of Trent, held in the mid-16th century, reaffirmed celibacy as the shining crown of the clergy. But it also quietly acknowledged the obvious. They were losing ground. Because the world outside the cloister was changing fast. Printing presses were spreading new ideas. Common people were reading scripture for themselves. And the notion that desire was shameful was starting to seem, well, a little medieval. Still, the centuries of monastic restraint didn't disappear overnight. Even in Protestant regions, the memory of celibacy lingered like incense, faint but persistent. It shaped art, morality, and the way people thought about love itself. You can hear it in the music of the time, in the hymns that spoke of divine longing, still echoing the language of old monastic devotion. You can see it in the paintings, where saints gaze upward with that same soft intensity that once filled cloisters. Desire had finally been let out of its cell. But it hadn't lost its holiness. It had simply changed form. And what of those who never married? Some monks chose to remain celibate even after they were freed from their vows. Not out of guilt, but because solitude had become a kind of peace. One former Carthusian, writing in 1550, said, "I have seen both the silence of the cell and the noise of the tavern. I have loved neither, but learned from both." It's a line that feels like the end of something ancient, a quiet understanding that discipline and desire can coexist, without either destroying the other. By the 17th century, monastic celibacy had lost its monopoly on holiness. People could be married and still be devout. Priests in Protestant lands could preach about love without blushing. And while the Catholic Church held onto its rules, even there, the tone began to soften. The medieval obsession with controlling the body gave way, slowly, to a gentler idea that the body was part of the soul's journey, not its enemy. It's strange to think that it took 1,000 years of denial to arrive at such a simple truth. So now, as we drift toward the end of our long, quiet night among monks and mystics, it's worth pausing to listen, not to the chant of prayers, but to the silence beneath them. It's the sound of human longing. For connection. For meaning. For peace between the spirit and the flesh. The monasteries may have fallen, the vows may have faded, but that longing never went away. It just found new places to live, in love songs, in letters, in whispered prayers at night. Because holiness, in the end, was never about walls or vows or rules. It was about how gently we carry our desires, how honestly we live with them, without shame. And maybe, just maybe, that's the quiet redemption all those restless monks were searching for. So, as we close our eyes and let the last echo of the bells fade into the dark, let's remember them kindly, the weary, well-intentioned souls who tried to make saints of themselves by denying what made them human. They failed, of course. But they failed beautifully. And in that failure, they left behind something strangely comforting, a reminder that even in silence, even in restraint, the heart keeps whispering. Always. Hey everyone. We've come a long way tonight. From the damp, candlelit cloisters of the Middle Ages to the echoing cathedrals of the Reformation. From whispered confessions to wedding vows. And now, As we drift toward the end of this story, maybe half asleep, maybe not, it's time to ask a quieter question. What did all that celibacy do to us? To the way we love, to the way we pray, to the way we think about being human? Because the truth is, the medieval monasteries may have vanished, but the ghost of their discipline is still here. It lingers, in the words we use for love, in the guilt that still seeps through our ideas of desire, and in that old, familiar tug-of-war between body and soul. Let's drift through that for a while. When the monasteries first appeared, they were radical. They rejected everything the world valued: wealth, family, pleasure, power. To the medieval mind, that kind of sacrifice made sense. The world was dangerous, unpredictable, soaked in sin. Celibacy, in its way, was an escape hatch, a path out of the chaos. But as centuries passed, it became more than a religious rule. It became a mindset, an invisible architecture shaping how Europe thought about virtue. Holiness meant restraint. Purity meant silence. Love was something to be translated into Latin and scrubbed of warmth. And yet, the human heart kept leaking through. You can see it in medieval art, saints carved with delicate faces, their hands almost trembling with unspoken tenderness. You can hear it in the hymns, the ones that start as prayers but end up sounding suspiciously like love songs. In a way, celibacy didn't destroy passion, it preserved it. It turned it into something eternal, untouchable, and strangely beautiful. But there was a cost. Centuries of religious celibacy made desire feel dangerous. It made love seem like a weakness to overcome instead of a strength to honor. Even after the Reformation, that thinking lingered. The Victorians, with all their lace and restraint, were basically the spiritual descendants of medieval monks, outwardly modest, inwardly obsessed. They talked endlessly about virtue and propriety, while writing novels that throbbed with repressed longing. Even modern romance, the kind you see in books and films, still carries traces of that same contradiction. We want love to feel pure, but also forbidden. That tension, between what's sacred and what's sensual, has never really gone away. And yet, there's something oddly tender about the legacy of celibacy. Because in their effort to rise above desire, monks and nuns ended up creating a language for it, one that was spiritual, poetic, and deeply human. They wrote of longing for God in the same breathless tones lovers use for each other. Julian of Norwich spoke of Christ as a mother, nurturing and gentle. Bernard of Clairvaux described divine love as a wound in the soul. Even the most austere mystics couldn't talk about holiness without turning it into a kind of intimacy. It's as if, by denying the body, they made the soul more sensual. And that language survived. When modern writers talk about love as transcendent, about soulmates, about connection beyond the physical, they're echoing the mystics. When people describe heartbreak as spiritual, or intimacy as sacred, they're repeating, without knowing it, the whispers of the cloister. Even the idea of romantic restraint, the slow burn, the yearning glances, the almost touch, owes something to those long centuries of monastic denial. The monks may not have intended to shape the language of romance. But they did. By repressing their desires, they taught us how to describe them. Of course, not everyone found beauty in restraint. As modernity crept in, the pendulum swung the other way. Desire became something to be celebrated, not hidden. The body, once seen as sinful, was reimagined as sacred in its own right. But even freedom carries memory. Every time we say making love instead of having sex, we're borrowing from that old idea, that intimacy is something more than physical, that it reaches toward the divine. It's a lovely thought, really. That 1,000 years of silence somehow taught us to speak more softly about love. And then there's guilt, the shadow that never quite went away. Even now, centuries later, people still struggle with the same question those monks asked in the dark. Is it wrong to want? Modern psychology says no. Religion varies. But the residue of medieval celibacy still lingers in the culture, a subtle voice that equates virtue with restraint, and pleasure with shame. You can see it in the way society still polices desire. Who gets to express it? Who's punished for it? Who's forgiven? In that sense, the monastery never really closed. It just moved inside the human mind. And yet, there's a kind of peace in acknowledging that history. because once you see where those ideas come from, you can decide which ones to keep. The monks weren't wrong to seek stillness. They weren't wrong to crave meaning beyond the flesh. They were just incomplete, like all of us. They tried to love purely, but purity without passion is only half a life. And passion without purpose is half a soul. Between those two halves lies the real human story, messy, contradictory, endlessly searching. That's what the monasteries taught us, even in their failure. That holiness isn't found in silence or excess, but in balance. In learning to sit quietly with your desires, not denying them, not indulging them, just listening. So, if you're still awake, or even if you're halfway dreaming, imagine those old cloisters again. Empty now. The ivy growing where monks once walked. The wind moving through arches that once echoed with prayer. It's peaceful there, in a way the Middle Ages never were. Because the struggle has ended. The monks are gone. The vows are broken. But the yearning, the deep, gentle ache for something more than the self, that still lingers, softer than ever. Maybe it's not lust or holiness anymore. Maybe it's just a quiet wish to be seen, to be known, and to be loved, not despite our desires, but through them. That's the legacy of monastic celibacy. Not repression. Not guilt. But the reminder that even the act of wanting, even the soft, wordless ache, can be sacred if we hold it with honesty. So, as we close this long, slow drift through history, take one last breath. Let the cloister fade. Let the candle gutter out. And let the centuries fall silent again. Because in the end, whether saint or sinner, monk or dreamer, we all carry the same quiet truth. That to be human is to long, and to love, and to learn to rest peacefully between the two. Soft outro, spoken gently. Thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. And if you're still awake, just listen to the silence, the same silence those monks once prayed into. It's patient. It's forgiving. And it's still here, waiting for us to fall asleep. Good night, traveler.